thank you for coming, for the people here in person and online. First, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land on which we meet today, and I would like to pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. So my name is Ingrid Valladares, and I'm a council member at the AAA Queensland, and it's my privilege tonight to introduce you to Dr. Donovan, who is a senior lecturer in international relations at Griffith University. Uti's research is focused on peace building and peace processes in conflict-affected societies. Her work has explored the gender dynamics of peace building, interactions between local and UN-led peace building processes, the responsibility to protect principle, and pragmatic ethics. Uti's work has been published in many journals, such as International Affairs, Cooperation and Conflict, and Journal of Global Security Studies, to mention some. So tonight in her talk, Uti will discuss the impacts of digital tools on women's participation in peace processes, more specifically in Libya and Yemen, where she conducted her latest research. She will discuss how COVID has facilitated opportunities for women participation in peace processes, but at the same time, she will highlight some of the challenges that are perceived at the moment with accessibility to digital tools and how this perpetuates some masculinities and other elitist practices within the peace processes. So Uti's presentation will be around 30 to 40 minutes, and then we will open the next 20 minutes for any questions for the people attending in person and online. This will be moderated by Ben online and of course me in person. And then Graham will just give some closing remarks and announcements. So thank you very much, and let's welcome Uti on her wonderful presentation. Looking forward to hearing everything.
Thank you. Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you for the invitation to come and give this talk here tonight. I'm really honored to be here. So today's talk is called Gender and Digital Diplomacy, Emerging Field of Research and Practice. And I want to start off with a picture that in many ways encapsulates the issue that I will be talking about, which is women's underrepresentation in peace processes. So the picture that we have here, this is from the Yemeni peace process, 2018. These talks took place in Sweden, Stockholm. And as you can see, from roughly about 15 individuals in this picture, we only have 2 women. And actually one of them, the lady in that red jacket, is the former Swedish Foreign Minister, Margot Wallström, who was actually mediating the talks. This picture here is not an exception when it comes to women's participation in peace processes. It is very much the rule. Now, if we look at some of the statistics, for example, from 1992 to 2019, we know that 7 out of 10 peace agreements had no women signatories or witnesses at all. More recent data from UN Women suggests that only about 16% of participants in peace processes are women. Now, why is this a problem? Well, as Sanam Andalini, she's a very well-known global peace and gender advocate. She argued that war makers rarely have the skills and the experience in peacemaking that one requires for peacemaking. We do know that oftentimes making peace is actually a lot harder than making war. Now, if we only allow those who took part in the fighting in the first place to have a seat at the table, then I would argue we are missing significant skills and capacities that others might bring to the table. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about sort of justify today's topic, if you like. And I want to make 4 arguments for increasing women's participation in peace processes. And the first one of those arguments has to do with efficiency. Now, there's quite significant body of empirical research that tells us that there's a positive correlation between increasing women's participation and outcomes, positive outcomes of peace processes. So the more women you have involved, the more likely is there to be a peace agreement at the end of peace talks. And that peace is also more likely to be more durable. So there's a very robust positive correlation between women's participation and outcomes of peace processes. Second argument has to do with justice. And this is pretty simple argument. Roughly about half of populations in a given society are women. Now, when you are excluding women from these processes, very significant, important political processes, you are effectively excluding half of your population. Now, this is pretty problematic from the perspective of basic rights. The third argument very much builds on that justice argument. And the point here is that peace processes, peace negotiations are oftentimes about a lot more than just bringing end to violence. They are about putting in place a roadmap for the future of the country. So for the peace building, post-conflict peace building phase, if you like, or the transition from war to peace. It's about writing constitutions. It is about redesigning political institutions. It is about redesigning economic institutions. Now, if you don't have a say in that process, it may well be, the risk is that you will be quite significantly disadvantaged in the future. The fourth argument has to do with gender-specific needs and priorities. So oftentimes, if you don't have women represented in peace talks, the specific needs and priorities of women aren't often then reflected in those peace agreements and in those roadmaps for the country's future. We know that armed conflicts affect men and women differently. So we know, for example, that while vast majority of battlefield casualties are men, we know that wartime sexual violence disproportionately affects women. We also know that when guns fall silent, if you like, when wars come to an end, violence for women doesn't end. It's just different forms of violence. So we know, for example, that in countries that are transitioning from war to peace, rates of domestic violence are through the roof, right? So these are the sort of gender-specific needs and priorities that aren't often taken into consideration when women are excluded from those peace processes. Now, while the statistics on women's participation in peace processes look quite stark, and the stakes, as I just mentioned, are quite high in terms of leaving women out, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the ways in which peace processes are conducted, and those changes may have quite significant and important implications to women's participation. So what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic? It wasn't the start of the use of digital technologies in peace processes by any means, but it very much accelerated the use of very simple sort of off-the-shelf technologies like Zoom and technologies that we're relying on tonight. In order to keep the momentum of peace processes in places like Libya, for example, in order to keep the momentum going, 2020, peace mediators decided to try to take those processes online. Now, many in the peace mediation practitioner community, they saw this as potentially a very, very positive development from the perspective of making peace processes more inclusive. And they argued that these digital technologies, again, Zoom, Teams, they can actually empower marginalized groups not just women, other marginalized groups too, but they kind of function to sort of open up these peace processes. And I'll come back to that point a little bit later on. So during the COVID pandemic, peace processes started to look a little bit more like this. And this is a screenshot from a mediation meeting in Libya. So it is in that context, or against that backdrop of, on the one hand, women's exclusion from peace processes, but then these quite significant changes into how peace diplomacy is conducted, that I've been doing research on, looking at, well, how does this digital peace diplomacy, how does it actually then impact women's participation?
You are sharing your microphone. Click to control sharing. Submenu 2 of 3.
That's all right. So moving on. So in order to think about this issue empirically, I've started off with a brief pilot study, and I want to share the findings from this study with you tonight. I looked at two cases. I looked at the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, which was essentially the Libyan peace process that was in full swing in 2020 when the pandemic hit. And then I also looked at Yemen, where there wasn't actually a formal peace process going, or it hasn't been since 2018. But there was a lot of sort of behind the scenes activity. So what I've done, I interviewed 24 individuals altogether from these two countries. I interviewed individuals who took part in the Libyan peace process. I interviewed peace mediators, peace mediation support staff, and various civil society actors. And I will talk quite extensively about some of their experiences and perspectives. I focused on, in looking at these two cases, I focused on the peace process as consisting of multiple peace tracks. So oftentimes when we think about peace processes, we kind of think about the headline grabbing sort of formal peace talks, where you have ministers, militia leaders, whoever it might be, sitting down and trying to broker, trying to find a solution. So those are sort of the track one talks. Those are called track one talks, kind of the national formal talks. But we of course know that in reality, those talks are kind of tip of the iceberg. We know that there's generally in most peace processes, we find sort of simultaneous parallel peace negotiation tracks happening. So for example, track 2 negotiations, we generally tend to see religious leaders, ethnic leaders, academics, NGOs, and so on, trying to find ways to end the armed conflict. And then we have so-called track 3 negotiations that are kind of involve grassroots actors, so community activists. It might be sort of village, town, community-based efforts to negotiate an end to violence. Now, why am I looking at all these sort of different, if you like, tracks of peace processes? Well, for the simple reason that while women are in most cases excluded from those track 1 negotiations, they actually play really, really important roles in those track 2 and track 3 processes. So in order to understand more, kind of get a more comprehensive view of how digitalization impacts women's meaningful participation, it's really important to kind of look beyond the tip of the iceberg. Now, there's a lot I could say about my case studies, but I don't think I really have time for that. I've been researching Libya for quite a long time. I could talk about it the whole night, but I won't. Suffice to say, they're They're both very interesting cases, and in many ways, they're quite representative when it comes to women's role in peace processes. In both cases, women were very much at the front lines of protesting very brutal regimes. They were asking for political rights. So they were the allies, if you like, of men during that part of the process. But they have since been sidelined almost completely. In Yemen, we've seen almost a decade of violence now, and in Libya, decade plus of ebb and flow of armed conflict between various different parties. We've seen the UN take a very active role in both cases, mediating, trying to find a mediated solution, trying to broker a peace deal. Despite the UN's active involvement, again, women have played a very, very minor role in those formal track one talks in these two cases. And I'll come back to those, and I'll talk quite a bit more about some of those experiences and perspectives that I heard from my interviewees. But I want to go back to some of the barriers to women's participation. So I started off with those quite dramatic statistics about women's underrepresentation in peace processes. But I never really answered the question, well, why? Why are women, why do they continue to be excluded? And there's actually a number of different obstacles or barriers to women's participation, ranging from logistical and economic to social, political, and security related barriers. And I want to talk about those a little bit more. Before talking about those barriers, you may see I've kind of highlighted the word meaningful in red, and that's a really important point to note here. So I'm interested in, and I think we should all be interested in, women's meaningful participation, because what we see very often is tokenistic participation. So what we tend to see in peace processes is that delegations bring in one or two token women who have absolutely no influence in the process whatsoever, right? And that enables these delegations to say, like, oh, you know, we've done the right thing. We have women. We are look how progressive we are. What we're really interested in is meaningful participation, right? So a type of participation where individuals actually can have an influence in the process. So, for example, they might be able to get an agenda or item in the peace negotiations agenda, right? That would be a sort of example of meaningful participation. Okay, so various different barriers to women's participation, and I will very quickly talk you through some of these barriers. Now, firstly, there's quite significant logistical barrier. You may be aware, peace processes, peace talks often take place somewhere else, abroad. So think about the Oslo peace talks, think about the Dayton talks that brought an end to war in Bosnia. The Libyan peace talks have, in most cases, have taken place in the neighboring countries. So, in order to actually attend these peace talks, you have to travel, and that requires funds. It requires access to travel documents. In many societies, women actually need mahram or chaperone to travel, which sort of complicates things further. We also know that unpaid caring work still falls disproportionately on women in most societies. So there's quite significant logistical and economic barriers. Women might not be, simply able to sort of travel abroad, disappear for a week or two to attend these peace talks. Now, we know, of course, that women are not a homogeneous group. These are not issues for many women. female ministers, for example, that might be attending peace talks. Well, these issues probably aren't necessarily a massive barrier. But if the aim, and this is a really big push from the UN in particular, if the aim is to make peace talks more inclusive, what we mean by inclusion is not just simply kind of adding more of those elite women, but actually trying to bring those civil society actors in order to increase the buy-in from the rest of the society. So particularly when we are thinking about these civil society, sort of the so-called non-elite women, for the lack of a better word, these are actually sort of quite practical, but real significant barriers to participation. Social barriers. I would argue these are probably the hardest barriers to participation to overcome. And what I mean by social barriers, I'm talking about gender norms and stereotypes. Armed conflicts, but also peace processes, they're very sort of male-dominated spheres, if you like. In many societies, conflicts, but also peace talks, they're not seen as sort of appropriate space, if you like, for women. And the women that are invited into these talks, that are part of delegations, they often report that their credibility and their legitimacy is often questioned just because of they are women. So that very deep masculine culture that underpins conflict and peacemaking is actually quite an important obstacle. There's also political obstacles, and the first one is very practical. When different parties to a conflict, when they put together delegations to send to peace talks, well, they generally draw those delegations firstly out of sort of high-ranking military leaders, but possibly from ministries, from party leadership, and so on. And if you don't have women in those positions, then that already pretty quickly translates into underrepresentation of women. We also have to think about aims of the peace process, or peace processes in general. There's a very kind of pervasive mindset in thinking, well, let's just stabilize the situation. We just need to kind of bring an end to the violence. Now, who are the individuals that are perpetrating the violence? Who are the individuals that hold the guns? Well, those are the individuals we need to kind of invite to negotiate an end to war. And that's in a way logical, right? But as I kind of said in the beginning, many women's rights activists would argue that, well, that isn't good enough. Because again, you need a different skill set, if you like, in order to make peace compared to making war. And oftentimes the individuals who make war aren't the best placed to make peace. Finally, lack of support from third-party mediators is a significant obstacle. Empirical research tells us that this is one of the most important things that help women to participate in a really, really meaningful way. But what we know that mediators, so for example, UN diplomats, they're often fairly reluctant to kind of push for that women's participation. They don't want to use their political capital for that purpose. They worry that sort of insisting on women's inclusion might actually jeopardize a peace process that might be already pretty fragile anyway. So they don't want to sort of rock the boat too much, so to speak. Finally, security-related barriers. So we know that individuals and groups who are opposed to women's participation in peace processes, and oftentimes, but not always, we're talking about, for example, militias or other groups that hold very conservative views. They are often prepared and willing to use violence to prevent women from participating. So in places like Libya, for example, a number of high-profile women's rights activists and female politicians have been assassinated in the past few years. And those assassinations have been linked to their high profile roles in Libya's political life. So as you can see, the barriers to women's participation are quite immense and very, very complex. So in what way might we then assume that digital technologies like Zoom or Teams might actually help us to overcome some of those barriers? Well, there's three assumptions at least that we can make. And the first one is that digitalization offers more access points to peace processes. I talked about those logistical barriers. Well, now you don't have to worry about traveling across potentially very dangerous conflict zones. You don't have to worry about having the funds, passports, and so on to travel to a different country. You can simply log in, right? That's the very kind of basic logic here. A second assumption we can make is that digitalization equalizes interactions among participants. So what we're talking about here, there's again research to indicate that if you sort of look at the interactions amongst individuals in sort of your standard face-to-face peace mediation, there's a lot of so-called sort of gendered power plays there. So who sits where becomes an issue. Who speaks first, right? We know that women generally speak last and least. They tend to be interrupted. There's a lot of, folding arms, rolling eyes, a lot of verbal and non-verbal sort of, power plays, as a colleague calls them. Now, assumption might be that we might actually be able to alleviate some of those when we at least partly move these processes online. So all of a sudden, we are all equally sized boxes on a screen in a random order. There's a host that has a mute button. So the assumption is that actually makes a difference in terms of particularly those sort of gendered interactions that we tend to see. Thirdly, a digitalization may enable feedback loops between the different negotiation tracks. So as I mentioned before, women kind of tend to be stuck, if you like, in those tracks 2 and 3. And their work there is really, really important. But of course, the aim is to try to make sure that they can also take part in those track 1 talks, where those really, really important decisions are taken, right? And the idea here is that, well, maybe we can use digital technologies to connect those different tracks, right? So for example, you might have live streaming between the different talks, or you might be using messaging applications between the different tracks and so on. And I will come back to that in a minute. But of course, while digital technologies can have all these really important affordances in terms of making these processes more inclusive, we have to remember that there is significant digital divide, and it is very gendered. So, for example, in low and middle income countries where armed conflicts are more likely, 327 million fewer women than men use mobile internet. There's a lot of data on this sort of gendered internet user gap. So not everyone is connected. And the risk here, of course, is when we move towards this digitalization, that we are kind of further marginalizing and excluding those who may not have access. And again, women aren't homogeneous group. So there might be women, for example, from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, or who might live in rural areas, that may actually be sort of excluded or marginalized further due to digitalization. So it's a very kind of lengthy introduction to the topic, but these are some of the assumptions and some of the prior findings that I've been thinking about quite a lot the past few years. So I'm going to very quickly, I don't think I have a whole lot of time, so I'm going to very quickly walk you through some of the things that I've found so far. This is a pilot study, so it's very much the beginning rather than end of this line of research. But I'm hoping there's some interesting kind of tidbits that come out of here for future research. So, in a nutshell, in the cases of Libya and Yemen, there is definitely digitalization does have quite significant potential to overcome some of the barriers. And we're specifically talking about here logistical and political barriers to participation. But the social barriers, so those gender norms and stereotypes, and security-related obstacles remain. Importantly also, what my research so far indicates is that while digitalization supports women's meaningful participation in those track 2 and track 3 spaces, it's not really bringing new women into those track 1 formal negotiations. So the hope that many had a couple of years ago is that using Zoom and Teams will kind of open up the negotiation table, if you like. I don't think that's happening. I want to just quickly go back to some of those barriers that I introduced before, and try to kind of work through, well, to what extent is digitalization helping us to overcome those barriers? In terms of logistical issues, well, one of the findings is that digitalization provides mediators more flexible mechanisms for inclusion. So the lady in the picture here, she's Stephanie Williams. So she was the UN chief negotiator in Libya. And I interviewed her for this project, and she was very clear about it. She said, well, if it wasn't for Zoom, the pre-negotiations discussions and advisory consultancy sort of meetings we had, they would have been very, very different. We were able to consult a huge number of civil society actors, marginalized communities, and to get a much better view of what should be on the agenda when the peace talks actually happen. So according to Williams, digitalization made actually a really, really big difference in that pre-negotiation phase. What I also found is that digitalization very much facilitates coalition building among women and women's groups. There is this assumption, or empirical research tells us, that women's groups, they tend to be more influential if they can kind of build united front. Now, in places like Libya, and this is what one of my informants was telling me, there are quite significant divisions among those civil society actors. Some of them won't even sit in the same room with each other. Now, what this informant was telling me is that actually when we have these meetings, these kind of networking, coalition building meetings, when we do them through Zoom or Teams, it's actually much easier to bring those big personalities and these various different groups together. So they might not want to sit in the same physical room. We can actually bring them into a Zoom meeting. So as I said, all in all, digitalization can help in terms of those track 2 and 3 spaces. But again, very little evidence, if any, really to indicate that we're kind of opening up the peace process. Now, in terms of social barriers, and these again are sort of the gender norms and stereotypes. And again, there were some interesting findings. So in places like Libya and Yemen, mediation, sort of local level mediation, can sometimes be really complex in the sense that women aren't meant to be in the room with sort of unrelated men, right? Again, once you bring those sort of mediation sessions to online environments, it is actually considered acceptable for those men and women to sit in those same meetings, mediation meetings. So that's quite significant. A lot of my interviewees also felt that it's easier for women to speak up online, right? So someone said more courage, women have more courage to speak up in these online spaces. But some of my interviewees also indicated that we are seeing many of these kind of gender dynamics and gender norms just simply transferred into these online processes. Someone that I interviewed, she was involved in track 2 mediation in Yemen. They organized sort of online meeting. And what she said, all the women who joined were in the partner organization's office, and all the men joined from their individual devices. Men talked, and then women. This created an unfortunate dynamic whereby women were lumped together, having one chance to speak. So very much kind of replicating some of the pretty well-known dynamics in in-person mediation. Another informant who was an expert on so-called peace technologies, they pointed out that if online meetings are designed according to the same format as in-person meetings, gender dynamics are replicated in those spaces. In terms of political barriers, I mentioned that assumption that digitalization may help to create sort of feedback loops, might help to bring those different negotiation tracks together. And there is some evidence that that is indeed happening. So one of the individuals I interviewed, she was part of track 2 negotiations, and she told me about this sort of instant messaging connection that her group had with the female delegate who was part of the track 1 negotiations. So this interviewee said that she used her phone to keep the women's track up to date on what was going on, and the women's track would give their opinions through her. So that was, again, quite important in terms of trying to make sure that, you know, women's participation isn't limited only in those tracks 2 and 3. This one is really important. Digitalization, in the cases of Libya and Yemen, seemed to facilitate access to mediators and high-profile political actors. So many of my Yemeni interviews mentioned how during and after COVID, when much of the interaction moved online, they have since had much more frequent contact with the UN chief mediator. So they felt like they now all of a sudden have kind of, you know, more or less sort of direct channel to the UN chief mediator, which didn't actually exist before. Another really interesting anecdote, I heard this from an interviewee very, very familiar with the Libyan case. And she told me about the situation when some of the women delegates in Libya, they were concerned about a particular provision in the peace agreement that was in the process of being negotiated. So they wanted to set up a meeting with the Prime Minister to express their concerns. This meeting was organized online, so it took place in Teams or Zoom. And the Prime Minister listened to the women's concerns and the issue was addressed. So it was a good outcome for these women. But what my interviewee told me was that this meeting would have not happened if it wasn't for this video conferencing technology. The Prime Minister would have never ever agreed to meet those women in person. And what they told me, and I'm quoting them, the optics would have been wrong. They were worried about, the Prime Minister would have been way too worried about being photographed meeting these women. The political cost would have been too great. So these are some of the important ways that digitalization can actually help women's participation. What I also found was that these video conferencing platforms provided a more structured negotiation environment. So again, Stephanie Williams, the UN chief negotiator in Libya, she was very open about it. She said, well, I used my rights as the mediator, I used the mute button. And she said, I gave more airtime to women. She was very frank about it. Now, and apologies, I'm going through this fairly quickly because I know we're running out of time. Now, in terms of security related issues, now, while some of my interviewees, they talked about how screen provides safety for women, but that was a small minority. Actually, quite a few of my interviewees raised some very, very serious concerns about being online related to security. In Yemen, these issues have to do with digital surveillance of women. So male family members monitor women's use of phone, use of internet. To access a Zoom meeting, for example, in certain parts of Yemen, you need a permission. In Libya, security concerns, but different. In Libya, women participating, high-profile women in politics, women participating in these peace processes have been subjected to really, really awful defamation campaigns. And as I mentioned before, a lot of this violence also hasn't just kind of been virtual, so to speak. It has transferred into the offline world. Again, a lot of very high-profile Libyan women have been assassinated for speaking out on issues. So there's a real hesitancy and concern amongst many women about being in those digital spaces. There may also be new barriers to participation, and this is something I alluded to before. We know that access to these online spaces, ownership of devices, and digital literacy are significantly gendered, and that came out very, very clearly in my interviews. There is also very much the risk that digitalization is kind of increasing this elitism. So in Libya, for example, in 2020, when the peace process was sort of starting to gain momentum, there were very, very frequent electricity blackouts. So only the individuals who had a generator were able to actually log into these meetings. And the cost of having a generator is needless to say, quite significant. So there are all these sort of dimensions to do with sort of intersecting inequalities that we have to take into consideration. So to briefly conclude, my initial findings indicate that digitalization has very kind of varied effects on women's participation. On the one hand, it may be lowering some of those logistical and some of those political barriers, but it does seem that those security-related barriers and barriers to do with gender norms and gender stereotypes, they're certainly not something that digitalization can very, very easily overcome. So the challenge I think we have is this: how can we use digital tools in a way that supports greater gender equality and supports not only women's greater participation, but also other marginalized groups, youth, ethnic and religious minorities? And how can we make sure that digitalization supports greater participation, not only in those kind of parallel processes, track 2 and 3, but how do we actually make the track 1 talks more inclusive? All right, I'll leave it there. I've been going on for quite a long time, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So So thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. It was fascinating to listen about your research, and more importantly, all the interviews. I guess that's the most interesting part when one is doing research. I have taken a lot of insights from your presentation, and it speaks a lot, even in the case of young people, and how they experience as well their participation in peace processes. And I would like to start with a question first, and then we will open it to the people in person and online. But with the research that you have done, I'm wondering whether participants have mentioned whether they prefer to continue these peace processes in person or online. I don't know whether you got some insights about that. We know that in both spaces, they still have the same challenges in terms of gender imbalance and participation. Were there any comments in terms of would they prefer to stay in person, do hybrid, so that it can be more inclusive to these marginalized groups that, as you mentioned, it's not only just that now some groups of marginalized women are participating, but also there are other factors as well that may not have, like the digital divide that exists as well. So yeah, I don't know if you can speak a little bit more on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and something I didn't really have time to go into. But of course, what we're saying, we're not the digitalization of peace processes doesn't mean that the peace processes are completely solely online. They're actually hybrids. That's the actual term that I should have really used. So they're hybrid peace processes, which means that they take place partly online and partly in person. Now, it is very likely that they will continue. Organizations, peace mediation organizations, governments everywhere are trying to reduce their carbon footprint. But of course, it's also from a practical perspective, it is sort of easier to organize and manage. So I think it is something that's here to stay. As to whether individuals think it's a good thing or not, I think it very much depends on those kind of intersecting inequalities and kind of where one sits within that space. So if you are sort of, say, elite woman, you live in urban area somewhere like Sana'a or Tripoli, it's a very different story to someone who lives, I don't know, somewhere south of Libya, where the internet access is very different, but where also the gender norms are quite different. So no, there's no, I didn't get a sort of a single finding on whether people think it's sort of a good thing. People are a bit ambivalent about it, but I think in many ways it is here to stay, this sort of hybrid mode. It will never, I don't think it will ever replace, in the context of peace diplomacy and diplomacy more generally speaking, I don't think it'll ever, digital modes of doing things, I don't think they'll ever replace the importance of the in-person trust building and communication.
Thank you. So are there any questions from the people online or here in person that you would like to ask? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, well, thank you, Uti, for that very insightful talk. And I can imagine that this is really a very new field of study and learning. So that it will take a while for peace mediators to develop up, that whole checklist as to how to make peace negotiations in the modern world more effective. I was thinking from my previous work in facilitating talks by health marginalized groups around the world into national health strategic discussions, female sex workers, MSM groups, injecting drug users and so on, who donors were insistent be involved in discussions about the national strategies for health, but often face major barriers because of the laws, because of the customs, because, the same issues. Tell me about any observations that you may have seen crossing over those areas of social participation through that type of human rights issue to the security and peace building processes.
Yeah, I mean, I think my focus again has mainly been on women, but I can definitely see how digital tools and some of their affordances can be very easily transferred to other contexts too. And as I mentioned before, this isn't gender equality isn't just about women, but it is bringing in sort of other constituencies into the process as well. Yeah, I can't say much about kind of beyond that quite sort of narrowly focused focused area that I've worked on. I know there's a lot of interest. The interesting thing is working on sort of related project with my colleague. We've been doing interviews with government officials in Switzerland and UN Women in New York. And a lot of those interviews have kind of sort of turned around. They've started asking us, like, well, what are the best practices in terms of these digital spaces and bringing women in? So there's a lot of demand.
Yes,
there's a huge amount of demand for this kind of knowledge, and I would imagine there would be important crossovers there in terms of thinking about human rights, human security, health related issues, more generally speaking. So unfortunately, it's not something I've had a chance to look into yet, but I can definitely see that being an important factor.
Another question here.
Thank you. It was amazing. You took me back to my work in Sri Lanka as well. I just want to ask, has there been any attempts by women's organizations where some of these women's organizations provided internet facilities to women who don't have access, to enable access to them? That's my first question. And second and last is, in an all women Zoom environment, let's say where there are ministers, like female ministers, and also women affected by like armed conflict, how has the interaction been? I'm kind of like more interested about, like you said, women are not a homogeneous group, but like how did these intersectionalities kind of come into play, like all women Zoom environment?
That last question is really interesting. I don't have an answer to that. But yeah, there were no particular observations or no particular interviewees who would have brought those issues up. What was your first question?
It was about whether women's organizations
providing. Yes, that was something that came up. So what seems to be what happened 2021 and 2022 in sort of the earlier years of COVID, and I suspect that might be changing now, but what happened quite a bit was that NGOs were providing kind of hubs for women to come and use the internet. What has also happened is that private peace mediation organizations, so you have, for example, CMI in Finland, Conflict Management Initiative, a German organization as well, I interviewed them for this project. So what they've done, they've actually been donating data for women's groups in order to be able to access these processes. So that's, of course, it's a bit of a band-aid short-term
Yeah.
solution. I think we have to be thinking quite seriously about actual sort of more permanent solutions. The issue, of course, is we're talking about conflict-affected societies, so infrastructure oftentimes has been destroyed. So they're very, very challenging environments. But yes, that sort of either donating data by sort of aid organizations, external actors, or just providing any UNDP in particular has been quite active in that space in sort of setting up hubs for these women to participate. That has been particularly the case in Libya. Thank you.
Can I ask another one? Have we got time? Going back to the original rationale for women's involvement in the peace processes, of that one is more likely to have a sustainable peace process if you get others involved rather than just the male perpetrators of the conflict. Intuitively, that makes a lot of sense to us all. But have we got some examples that one can use that say, look, in this situation, there were many women involved, and that that worked better than in others? Have we got some examples that we can point to?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple peace processes that are in many ways sort of exceptions to the rule of women's underrepresentation. So one is the Philippines,
right?
Where women played a very high profile role, and it's actually really interesting to look at. If you look at the number of gender-related provisions in the peace agreement that came out of those peace talks, it's actually very, very progressive. So the number of gender-related items there is quite remarkable. The Colombian peace process is another example where the women's participation was much greater than in many other peace processes. So if you're kind of looking for those sort of examples, those two are kind of most well-known cases. But what's interesting, and unfortunately I didn't have time to talk about it, but Stephanie Williams, she actually did a really, really great job in including women. And she was one of those kind of, in contrast to what I said, that peace mediators often don't want to get women involved. She was actually someone who said no. She insisted on, I think initially she insisted on 30% quota for women. They didn't quite reach that, but they got pretty close, which is remarkable given that it's been sort of, a handful of women here and there. So she put her foot down. She said, no, this isn't happening without women's participation. And what she told me is that these women played a really, really important role as sort of bridge builders. And we also know this from other peace processes. So when the talks stall, when you need a compromise, women often take a leading role in those sort of situations. They're often also more kind of willing, and we know this from just kind of politics in general. We know that women are kind of more likely to kind of, if you like, sort of cross party lines to talk to the other side, to kind of seek compromises and so on. And we see this in peace processes as well. Now, this isn't to say that all women are like that,
Sure.
There's of course men also that have those really important qualities, but I think it's something about kind of how men and women are socialized into particular ways of acting. There's a lot of research on negotiation that kind of shows that men and women have quite different ways of approaching things. So Philippines and Colombia, very interesting cases.
Excellent, thank you.
Are there any more questions? So Thank you very much, Uti, again for such a wonderful presentation. It's been fantastic to hear more about your research and what your participants have told you as well. And we're really looking forward to your future research and yeah, maybe who knows, coming up with some good practices on how we can use even digital tools in peace processes, which I believe is very important. And I guess we have seen something here in your presentation that there are opportunities at least to move all women to come to this track one that you were mentioning and not simply just having a voice, but actually influencing the policies and decisions made. So yeah, thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation. So I'm gonna ask everyone to clap to say thank you.